I will be judging with two wonderful panel. For the judges judging with me, can you please introduce yourself in the manner that is order in the order that is stated in the tab?
Hi everyone, my name is Ankit, Nazan the preference, and good luck for the round.
Hi everyone, I'm Helena. Congratulations and good luck.
Okay. Great. Before we start, couple of reminders. Firstly, please don't forget to state your PI preferences before you start your speeches. Secondly, please don't forget to time yourselves. I'm going to post timestamps in the chat, but also be better if you time yourselves. And finally, I highly encourage debaters to listen and accept PIs to make the debate more engaging. Let's start. Let's now call on the Prime Minister to start the debate, please.
Okay, give me a few seconds to. Okay, so the OG bench has two arguments. Number one, on how you actually increase support internally. So this means like within like political groups and stuff. And so number two, how you actually increase like support externally as well, which is on the focus of on like the people. But before that, a few layers of like case setup, few framing. Number one, what is PH's actual incentives? We think by adopting these populist ideals, PH can actually appeal to like a broader electorate, especially those people that act like currently feel neglected by the current like political discourse and status quo. We think that this would essentially translate into an increased amount of voter support and then result in a higher chance of winning more elections. So there is an electoral incentive for them to do this. So we think that sustaining power through these re-elections by maintaining a strong connection with the populace and addressing their like immediate concerns effectively is the most important thing. And number two, what does incorporating these populist ideals actually look like? We think that this looks like implementing more policies that directly impact the financial well-being of citizens. Things such as like cash transfers, um, or like subsidies for essential goods, things like reduced taxes for low income groups and more like job creation programs, things like that. And we think that there will also be an improved access to healthcare services by increasing like funding for public health, reducing like the cost of medical care, and implementing like um healthcare schemes and stuff like that. We also think that they'd be able to like develop more affordable housing projects and offer subsidies or like low interest loans to help citizens on like housing and stuff. Populist rhetoric doesn't essentially mean that you have to cater to one political side, and because you're a coalition, you at the end of the day you need to come to a consensus. So in the current status quo, we say that PH is like known for its reformist agenda, right? And they typically like focus on more institutional integrity, things like anti-corruption measures and like democratic principles and stuff. But we think that this approach hasn't fully resonated with like a broader electorate, especially those who feel like extremely marginalized or like neglected by mainstream politics. Look at like countries like the Philippines and like the US with Trump, where we have seen that like populism has gained more traction by actually directly addressing the immediate concerns of these ordinary people. And we see there has been an increasing global trend like populism, where populism has become like more of a dominant political method. Even in Malaysia, you look at UMNO, for example, with like strong ethnocentric narratives. So then our stance is extremely clear here, is that incorporating these populist ideals in PH would essentially be an electoral incentive for them. So then, quick clarification then is that populism isn't essentially going to be like necessarily going to be catered to one side, to like any other side, because at the end of the day, we say that PH is still a coalition, so there will be arguments on like the say in which populism will be pushed. So this means that like the policy you do won't be catered towards one side, which is why it still will have things like catering towards the emotional needs of like the people, right? So my arguments, my number one on how like increasing this external support is essential for PH to rally up like more increased support from the general public, and like especially those people that feel like they're neglected by traditional politics. So number one, we think that there is an emotional appeal to these people because like typically these like populist rhetoric uses like simple like relatable language that necessarily like resonates with the actual experiences and the frustrations of its citizen. So we think by focusing on their immediate needs and fears, such as things like um economic insecurity, we think that these populist rhetoric like has strong would gain more like emotional responses by the people, which could also like foster this sense of urgency and connection. And number two, how these populist messages are extremely like straightforward and very easy for the people to understand, which would therefore make it easier for them to also support. They typically utilize things like social media and rallies and more like direct forms of communication to like create a more personal like connection with these voters. And number three, how we denounce like other parties. And number four, like veil all your actual policies. People don't actually see your policies. So even if they are bad and hurt the people, it's fine, right? So we say that the impact of this is that there would be like an increased voter turnout. There'd be more emotional engagement, number one, and clear messaging. We think motivates these citizens to participate in the actual political process, which would therefore then mean that there'd also be like a higher voter turnout. We say that populist rhetoric can galvanize support from like these previously disengaged or these apathetic groups of voters, which would also expand like the party's base. And number two, how does like in electoral success, right? Because we are essentially addressing the immediate needs and concerns of this like wide range of voters from like places like rural communities or like urban areas, right? We say that there is like a diverse coalition of supporters, so that means that like yeah, we just gain more supporters, and so we say in like a closely contested um constituency, like the emotional and direct appeal of like an actual um populist rhetoric can actually like sway like actual voters that are like undecided, right? And so my second argument on how increasing this um like internal support, where we can also increase this internal support within these political parties, and number one, how we can have like a more unified vision because we have a more like common goal, because we're providing a clear unified vision that these party members can actually rally around, which we think would foster more like um internal solidarity. So we think that emphasizing a collective mission to address the needs of the people would essentially strengthen like this the party the unity of the party and its purpose. And then we also have like we also can encourage like these grassroots involvement, right, in policy making, and these campaign like efforts would also increase this member engagement and motivation. And why this is impactful is because number one, we say that this unified vision and purpose align with the actual efforts of the party members, which would lead to a more coordinated and effective governance. Number two, where we have this reduced infighting because we have these clear shared goals, which would essentially reduce like these eternal conflicts, right? Oh, okay, I'll just end there.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your speech. Let's now call on Leader of Opposition.
Can I just go to the toilet real quick? Sorry. Thanks.
Sure.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, yours.
You accidentally overcook your food and your oven gets on fire, do not burn down the rest of your house like an arsonist in an attempt to get more insurance. You douse the fire in water. We don't think government's line.
Hello. Yeah, I think speaker froze. Yeah, let's just wait for Kason to reconnect. Yeah, I also thought it was just me. Let's just wait for them. Gelson, can you contact your partner?
Oh, yeah, I'm trying to reach him right now.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Kason. You froze. Your video froze earlier.
Sorry, I think I like that. Yeah. Is it fine if I restart?
Yeah, no worries. Can restart.
Sorry. Yeah. Thanks. When you overcook your food and your oven gets on fire, your first thought should not be to burn down the rest of your house like an arsonist in an attempt to garner more insurance. It should rather be to douse the fire in water. We don't think the opposition's line of reasoning stands, therefore. How do we construct this debate? 3 points. Firstly, we think that in general, pushing populist ideals probably indicates a major shift in strategy, given that throughout history, Pakatan Harapan has generally been more centrist. This might look like, for example, introducing campaign on things like social welfare, a sudden spotlight on housing, and crucially, this motion necessitates a trade-off of other centrist policies, or else you would just be pushing the same policies as you would before. Secondly, we think that in terms of status quo, it probably looks like most Malaysians having political apathy, and this is a major problem that we need to combat. This is the fundamental reason why in the previous election it was a hung parliament, because there was very little margins to deal with. What we need to prioritize is swaying people on the fence, because they are the ones that are decreasing voter turnout. What we should not prioritize is pushing extremist values, because we think that those particular actors wouldn't have voted for you anyway. Our main line of logic is that we defend Pakatan Harapan, combating political apathy within this world, right? We think that we probably prioritize things like unity. We will probably forget about things like, focusing on like Burmese and Chinese, but rather uniting as one and as Malaysians, like Sayana Malaysia. And thirdly, we think that Pakatan Harapan is probably the optimal party to win this election. I think both sides agreed on this, because we're able to sway the policies just by debating. And then overall, they're probably the least extremist party that we have so far. Let's dismantle what OG brought to you. They give you two things. Firstly, internal support and buy-in. But if you look closely, a lot of that case is mitigatory, right? They're saying why it will be done well. Crucially, there is a fatal contradiction in this case, because A, they say that, oh, you can still push populist ideals without having to abandon your centrist positioning, and therefore you won't anger people or parties within you. But then two, they give you a lot of benefits, like getting grassroots movements and things that are more closely associated with socialism. I think therefore they cannot take both. It is a necessary trade, in which case I think that the more likely model that they're going to take is that they push a very hard populist stance. We think that this generates infighting. I think it's due sufficiently with internal support, given that a lot of times you attract people or parties from far ends of the spectrum. You have like far left and then far right. I don't think going far left is actually going to bode well with the right, probably going to indicate a leaning. Perhaps parties are going to drop out. We don't think this indicates stability. Then they talk about buying. And clearly, their line of reasoning here is that you have a clear messaging. Like, this is pretty symmetric. I think it is clear that a centrist positioning appeals more to the average person, and rather the populist ideals probably aren't as simple to understand as you not being too far right or you not being too far left. I think that is far more simple. Secondly, I think populism is generally seen as something that is more extremist. There is a stigma attached to it, which actually turns off the majority of people. Therefore, we think that government takes this hard stance of extremism, and even if they don't, we don't think all of their benefits can manifest. If that is the case, how does opposition combat voter apathy. The preface to this argument is that Pakatan Harapan, to some extent, is locked into a centrist positioning of appeal to all. The difference may be a shift in strategy, but given that you still have to appeal to your fellow parties, you cannot go over the board, right? Therefore, we think that Pakatan Harapan will always lose to other extremist parties, which directly engages with their case when it comes to appealing to extremist people or a voter base. Why? Because you have other parties like PSM or Perikatan Nasional who actually have more established and who are more well-known when it comes to these extremist ideals. If you suddenly want to become more populist, we think you will inherently lose to other parties who have actually established a logic far longer than you. Crucially, these voter bases would already have voted before, so we don't think that this changes anything now, given that you're just suddenly having a slight shift. Crucially,
Right.
how do we cater to people on the fence? Most of these people are undecided. They're apathetic when it comes to politics, right? 3 reasons why. For that, I'll take a point. Opening, closing.
Yeah. PSM literally has no support. It does not win a single seat. Your argument of PH losing to PSM when they go left is ridiculous and empirically false.
Yeah, like the point is that you can never win when it comes to such when it comes to like you becoming slightly more left, like you slightly becoming more populist. And even if there is no trade-off, you actually turn off right-wing supporters that we think you would have gotten if you had a centrist positioning. Okay, why are most people undecided and different? We think 3 reasons. Firstly, a lot of times communities are segregated. For example, how like you have Chinese and Malay enclaves. This probably means that a lot like you probably wouldn't care about the outcome, given that maybe your community is already a minority. You don't think this changes anything. Secondly, it's already generated a sort of pathetic culture where you don't care about whether or not you vote. And thirdly, in terms of historical precedents, like probably a lot of politicians that we voted in haven't done a lot, probably indicates a bad future down the line, which turns off a lot of voter. How do we deal with this? Because we provide people a safe option. And I'd like to note, in general, voting is seen as a good thing, right? But you actually like dissuade people when you introduce a more extremist and populist ideal because they don't necessarily want to be affiliated with something that is new or is not as like welcome in society. You might be a Malaysian Chinese who doesn't want to vote because you don't think your vote makes any impact or because you don't agree with with like their policies. We think Pakatan Harapan as a centrist party appeals to everyone, so you cannot go wrong when you vote for them because they guarantee that you're at least going to be heard to some respect. The comparative is that you turn off these people. We don't think that that's a very good. We don't think that's a very good point to make. But why was this argument so important? Because at some point in time, opposite government has to defend overshadowing certain communities or like dealing with the harms of socialism as indicated by a general trend towards like populist ideals, probably like I don't know, like a loss of productivity as is indicated by socialism. But the more direct, the more crucial harm here is that you actually foster identity politics on the side of government. Oftentimes, this manifests in the form of, for example, Pakatan Harapan appealing to specific groups, perhaps like the Bumis or the Malays, given that they cannot generate as much of a voter base as ours. But even if they can, the fact that they're going more towards a populist probably means they're going to set in stone more. This indicates more identity politics in which you try to segregate the community more in order for you to get more votes. This might look like, for example, weaponizing the rhetoric against your fellow opposition party, who now has to turn to another voter base like Malaysian Chinese because you've already targeted most of the Malays. We think that this generates a very unhealthy sphere of politics that all of us were not willing to defend.
We would like to thank the leader of opposition for their speech. Let's now call on Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, just checking if I'm visible audible.
Yes, sir.
Alright. Okay. 2. One. Problem with the allegory coming from Kaysen is that even though the house is burning, your whole state is burning, your whole country is burning, and therefore you might as well just burn with it and use the fire to your advantage. There's three things I'm going to argue in this speech. Firstly, why populism is necessary in the status quo and why it will be effective. Secondly, we're going to clarify the opposition comparative and show you why there's actually no delta on their side of the house and they don't actually fix anything. And then thirdly, how you create better political stability, which is the extension coming from my speech. But firstly, let's explain then why is populism necessary in the status quo. I think it's important to clarify at the top of this that's not pushing radical policies, right? That was the first part in terms of how you're able to necessarily push for certain things with populism, right? But we think the nature of populism itself is that it's going to be emotional rhetoric, right? Calling out other parties for their corruption, calling out other parties, for example, engaging in sodomy or something, right? These are going to be things that you likely engage in order to appeal to the emotions of the people. You likely appeal to the grassroots, and that's how you get all the benefits that you get from Victor's speech, right? Because he explains to you then more people are going to engage with you, the point at which you're actually going to be able to do these kinds of things. Because the problem in status quo is that people just don't understand your policies. That's why you have lower and lower voter turnout in favor for other more extremist and more radical parties, because those are simply easier to understand. That's why the simple narrative that Victor explained to you as the mechanism was so important. But the second thing to clarify, why does it actually have to be centrist then? Because I think the reason is relatively simple, right? PH is a coalition. So if you want to push out any form of political campaign, you likely need the support of all the parties within the coalition, right? Which likely means that the things that you're going to cater to isn't, for example, going to be like, oh, the Bhumis deserve all the land or the Chinese deserve all the land. It's likely going to be more like centrist things, like targeting other parties, right? Like saying, hey, these people aren't actually doing what they promised, or these people aren't actually the best actors, or maybe they're really corrupt. Don't think you actually have to clarify a certain positioning. The point is you're able to use populist rhetoric as a tool in the toolbox. That is the point in which you're able to create more support on our side of the house. In the worst case, fine, you segregate the Bhumis, you segregate the Chinese. At least PH is able to create some more support. They're able to stabilize their political position, which creates a better state in the future as well. Let's explain the mechanism then on why the global populist phenomenon necessitates your populist rhetoric. And the first thing to explain here is that people are just generally leaning towards populism, right? So sure, populism has created voter apathy, but it's also created more voter turnout, right? We think voter apathy was going to happen either way because people just don't want to engage with politics. But at the same time, because it's more simple to understand, you appeal, for example, to the younger voters, right? The people who actually listen to this and think like, hey, it's easier for me to engage in politics. Now, when you look at the US, for example, with like the whole US election becoming a populist phenomenon, right? You look at, for example, UMNO in Malaysia, where you have a large amount of populist rhetoric. What you're able to do with emotional appeal then on our side of the house is able to do things like humanize the party that you don't have in status quo, because all you do is like push out policies after policy that people just don't understand because they're too intricate and they're too deep or like in depth for them to actually understand the sort of nuances of your policy. But secondly, you're able to engage the younger demographic and the grassroots, right? Because the point at which you're able to do things like say, hey, these people are probably really important, or like the younger generation is the one that is going to be really important. That's where you're able to deal with things like voter apathy that also desperately wants to protect. You're able to like engage with, for example, the grassroots movements, right? Because you're saying like, hey, these are important things that we need to care about. That's why you need to vote for us. Likely, then these are things that you're able to do on our side of the house, the point at which you use that rhetoric by explaining that, hey, we are the good guys. You use an us versus them narrative in order to paint the PH as the best form of party. What you're then able to do is other things, right? Like call out other parties, calling them corrupt or having engaged in sodomy or something. And the reason why this will be good and there isn't an existing oversaturation in status quo of populism is because people are generally just going to buy into populism anyways, right? Even if people are tired of it, what Kason said is correct. Voting is seen as something that's generally good. If you don't vote, there's a stigma against you because it's like, hey, you're not doing something to help your nation. What that means then is that likely you're still going to have people that are voting, which and the way in which they're like the number of which like voters are going to happen is going to be symmetrical on both sides of the house. It's just which side of the house you're able to use the tactic to pull the most amount of voters onto your side from the fence. That is exactly the reason why you need populist rhetoric. The impacts here are rather clear then. You're able to drown out any attempts outside of populism in terms of actual policy change because it dominates the media narrative, right? Because everyone's inadvertently using populism anyways. When you're on our side of the house, then you like other people are going to use populism to drown out your actual like policies and stuff. So you're able to combat this, right? But I think it just makes it a lot easier to push a narrative as well on our side of the house, because instead of needing to explain the intricacies of your policies or something, you can just have like one slogan, for example, that you just push in every single political campaign, which means at least at best you're able to decrease voter apathy at least slightly on our side of the house, but at worst you're still able to put yourself on the same level as other parties, which is important because that's when you're able to put yourself on the same playing field to be able to pull more voters. Otherwise you're just going to lose out to them with nothing in return. The comparative is that in absence of this, you just concede to populist rhetoric from other parties. You concede to having more voters go to those parties. We think that's something that PH would never want. Before I go on to the next thing, I'll take any points, preferably closing.
Yeah, your version of populism, which is emotional rhetoric, isn't new. We've been doing this for years. What is the delta in your debate?
The delta is that you just haven't been using it to the extent that other parties have been using it. The reason why Pakatan Harapan is like not as popular as other parties in status quo, like I know they're a majority party, but the reason why they're losing support is because they haven't been pushing the populist rhetoric as much. So to everyone else, it seems they're more passive, right? The delta here is when you're able to use populist rhetoric, when you use it as a main tool in your, for example, political campaigns, that's when you're able to create the delta, because that's when you create that form of change. We think that's something that you can't access on the opposition side of the house because you don't use populist rhetoric. You have to explain to us in your extension where you create any form of change. The second thing I want to explain is clarifying the opposition comparative, because when you only use centrist things or like centrist policies, it's more likely you're going to lose voters anyways, right? If you look at status quo, the trend is that you're losing voters. If you don't do anything to explain this, then likely you're not going to create any form of change. We hear no mechanism from Kaysen. I think Gelson has to clarify this. But the last thing I want to explain is this speech, is how you create political stability. Because the point at which you use emotional rhetoric, that is when you're able to build your actual policies, right? I think most of the Malaysians in this room can agree that Pakatan Harapan probably isn't doing much for Malaysia, right? Which means as well, because your policies are also bad, people are also pulling away from you because you're not actually helping the people. What you're able to do now is hide all of your policies, right? Because you use emotional rhetoric, like, hey, you should still vote for us because everyone else is really shit. In the meantime, then what you're able to do at Pakatan Harapan is you're able to create this form of change, right? You're able to create this stability that you so desperately require. You're able to do things like reinvent or reform the political system in a way in which actually benefits you and creates stability. That's something that you can't get on their side of the house because everything is so transparent on their side of the house. They have no opportunity to create any form of change. For those reasons, you had to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for your speech. Let's now call on Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Okay, cool. I'll take POIs verbally. Start in 3, 2, 1. At this point of the debate, I know we're already far ahead of the glove bench. Because OG clearly doesn't know what populism is, and CG just knifed their main populist example in the info slide by saying they get 0 support and 0 votes. You want to be the ones to point out that the populist party in Malaysia gets 0 votes. Thanks for the odd bench win, bro. I want to start this speech by making something very clear. OG's case is a losing case because they sound exactly like the opposition with the extremely soft-lying stance that they want to have about centrism and stuff like that. They seem to think that populism just means being popular, and that means appealing to everybody you possibly can in the Malaysian politics. What does populism actually look like though? Because guys, you do not campaign for unity. You do not say, let's cross the floor and make friends. Because populism focuses on appealing to a particular group of people and uses a lot of us versus them rhetoric precisely because it is easier to understand. You look toward things like Trump in the MAGA movement with heavily anti-Muslim or anti-immigration lines, or Modi in India with heavily anti-Muslim lines within India by focusing on race-based politics. This is much more believable than OG's characterization because it's far more in line with the ideas that we have in InfoSlide and far more in line with reality. PSM is the most populist party, or one of the most populist parties in Malaysia. PAS is also a populist party in Malaysia. Both of them heavily focus on things like race-based politics because these are things that people can easily understand according to the OG. So populism on the Gulf actually has these two key characteristics. Firstly, far more divisive lines, opting into things like identity politics and easy to understand rhetoric. So this oftentimes means dividing the population by picking one or the other in terms of who we want to fight for. Secondly, far more radical messaging, i.e. you're heavily pushing for more pro-Bumi privileges that leads towards the exclusion and further division of the race gap between the Bumi and the Chinese. You are further perpetuating social class division between these two particular types of people because you need to pick one particular population for you to actively cater towards. This is the reality of populism on the OG. So it's completely unclear as to what exactly the entire centrist identity they want to push for was. We are the centrist one guys. We are the people on the opposition that say that we don't want to pick one particular path because we want to be able to focus on things like moving on with more pragmatic issues, moving on with the Madani government, moving on with things like perpetuating Malaysian unity. So the first question I want to answer in this speech is this a viable political strategy to garner votes? Garth uses a logical jump to conclude, oh, because PH lost votes to pass, that must mean that suddenly centrist politics don't work. That must mean populism must work. Why did they actually do seats though? I can point to a plethora of reasons that they are not that are not political positioning for why exactly PH lost a lot of seats in the previous election. Malaysia was just emerging from a post-COVID era that many people were dissatisfied from. PH inherited one of the most difficult to navigate global epidemics in the world, and of course, the Malaysian economy suffered as a result of it. Therefore, the PH's relatively okay, but still not that effective path in terms of actually dealing with the epidemic led towards a lot of people being disillusioned with the idea of PH rule. But the fact that but the fact that we like they're currently still in power doesn't means that it wasn't all that bad to begin with. I think that there's a lot of reasons as to why we can point towards PH losing seats to pass or other sort of populist parties in Malaysia, but it's largely speaking not the main one. I don't think this points towards populism being inherently better in any way whatsoever. But let's take them at the very best. Let's say that they did lose out because of populism and because you weren't being extreme enough. Kaysen's point was extremely important and was completely unengaged too, because we told you if you are trying to be populist, you will never be as populist as the other parties in Malaysia already. If you want to cater towards one particular party, you will never be able to out-populist PSM or out-populist PAS because you are a coalition comprised of political parties across the spectrum. You cannot vote entirely for left-wing policies because the right-wing parties in your party or in your coalition are not going to be happy about that. You cannot fully confirm whether or not you are supporting of the Boomies or the Chinese because these two are major components of your own coalition equally as well. So that's why if you're saying you want to opt into populism all of a sudden, you will never be able to beat PSM at their own game. Yes, PSM gets 0 votes. Yes, PSM gets 0 support. But it's all the more reason why you should not join them because obviously you're going to lose to them with less votes than 0 for some particular reason. This was us being very charitable though. The reality is, OG thus far suffers from a lack of understanding on what the current voter dynamics of Malaysia are. Kaysen told you the vast majority of the voter base suffers from a major indecisiveness on politics, which means you're not automatically guaranteed the voter base that you want if you just seem to cater to identity politics or race-based politics, like whatever OG wants to tell you. But I'm going to take this further because the reason for the political apathy in Malaysia was because people were tired of the rampant identity politics that have plagued Malaysia for the last decade. Tired of the populist rhetoric that PSM and PAS have pushed over towards the political ideologies, and tired of the long generational clash between different races in Malaysia to see which one is more superior or more oppressed than the other. So when DLO came out and said more youth came out to vote in the previous general election, he is clearly making up facts. In the previous general election, over a third of Malaysia's youth didn't even bother to show up because they were disillusioned by the exact populism that you preach already being showcased by PSM and PAS. For these very reasons, we don't think populism is the path to victory on the side of the government because you are actively losing out on a huge chunk of the voter base. The vast majority of the voter base doesn't care about race-based politics. They are oftentimes undecided. So when you choose to pick one or the other, you lose out on the other half of that voter base. At least on our side, we focus on things like unity. At least we say things like, let's not talk about race-based politics anymore. We're tired of that. Focus on things like moving forward as a Malaysian people, moving forward as a Malaysian unity. Before I move on, are there any POIs from closing?
Yeah. If youths don't turn out to vote, how does central policies make them turn out as compared to left policies?
So there are plenty of ways for us to combat youth apathy. Admittedly, these are both things that we both can do, like, better media campaigning, telling people that voting is important. But the problem is you guys are unable to make sure that you are catering to everybody, right? Because you're only catering towards a specific population and you're telling these people, okay, only youth of a specific race are people that will cater to, or we support things like Boomi rights, we support things like Chinese like superiority or whatever. This is completely unreasonable, and we're saying that you lose out in the long run because even if these people do turn up to vote, they're likely not going to be turning up to vote for you. We've proven the premise of winning the next election. How do we navigate the party after winning the election? And this is where OG really falls out of the debate. Because let's say that by some miracle, they do win the election, I'm going to assume they're opting to join PSM's lines in left-wing Malaysia to try to push for like far left-wing policies. The problem is you often sideline, like Kason told you, a lot of right-wing like parties that are already in your coalition. So that means a huge chunk of them actively are going to vote against your policies because of the fact that you are actively going against their political beliefs. There's a lot of political infighting that you're facing on the opening government and on the closing government, which is why you're never going to be able to have an effective government, even in the best case where you do win the election.
We would like to thank DLO for their speech. Let's now call a member of government.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Sorry, I need to close my window. Okay. I know none of you are Malaysian, so to make things simple and stop throwing around letters, we're going to be the first team in this debate to explain to you what the context is. There are three political parties mainly up for discussion in today's debate. One is PN and PAS, which is the far-right parties in Malaysia. There are reasons, systematic reasons on CG, we say people don't support them. They have corrupted leaders, they favor like the racial majority, they say really messed up things, they pass draconian policies. Example of this, they support the Taliban. They say air stewardesses who have too revealing attire when their skirts end above their knees. They want to teach the entire goddamn syllabus in Malay because teaching and learning English is apparently colonialism. They went on TikTok before the election and said, if you don't vote for me, you'll go to hell. That's the kind of ridiculous policies they have, and we don't think people support that. So Gelson is right. They only won in the past election because of a fluke. People are mostly disillusioned with the current cost of living and the government. We'll deal with this a bit later. Number two, PH is the centrist political party. Wesley's POI is a little bit wrong. PH is not very new. It's probably about less than 10 years old in comparison to like BN, which has been around for maybe 50 years, maybe longer, like independence or whatnot. It has a majority in parliament, but the reason they're very scared to touch politically sensitive issues is because they were a new political party, so they didn't want to risk injuring anyone. We think at this point it's best for them to move towards the left because they've already secured the majority. Number three, PSM. And this way I need to be really clear on what the debate is. Number one, it is empirically true that PSM is unpopular. This debate is about us moving towards the ideologies. Gelson says this is a knife. This is not a knife, bro. That's like saying people who advocate for Black rights movement have to side with the Black Panther movement. We don't. We can move towards the ideology. We don't have to support lynching white policemen insofar as we want to crack down on police brutality. You can move towards the left. You don't have to adopt the left, which has won 0 seats in the past election. So that's the framing I want to talk about. I'm going to do two things in this speech. One, how we combat extremist values. Two, how we deal with voter apathy. That's our extension. One, let's talk about dealing with extremist values. OO says you cannot out-left PSM. Again, very strange. Let's think about populist ideals and read the info slide. It says we push for policies like affordable housing and minimum wage. Why is this important? This is debate winning because the bottom 40% of Malaysia is exclusively made out of indigenous people and the racial majority in Malaysia. That is to say, even people who play race-based politics cannot argue against general broad social welfare for the poor because the poor are mostly from the racial majority. So I don't know why in the world someone would adopt a central policy over affordable housing for myself and my family. All's argument falls out of this debate. Two, we agree. Elections results were such because people were disillusioned with the status quo. People were broke. They didn't have enough cash handouts during COVID-19. People were not happy with how government handled the situation. Why is this important? Intrinsically, most people don't agree with past policies. They were just disillusioned with the current government. Like, I think it's ridiculous to say, oh, if I'm not voting for them, I'm going to hell. People like don't buy into this, guys. It's ridiculous. They just like don't like the current government and therefore they voted for that. The second clarification is that during the last election, there was no voter turnout for ethnic minorities. Gee, and that's pretty easy to see why. When the party that wins largely campaigns on race-based politics and benefiting the majority race, obviously people who are from ethnic minorities will not turn out. We think if you give them greater representation, they're more likely to turn out. Number three, let's talk about the centrist argument. And this is where knowledge of Malaysia comes in. And I'm going to explain this to you, panel. Malaysia is one of the few countries where we still have affirmative action laws. That is to say, there are universities specifically reserved for a particular race. Even there are properties reserved for like a particular race that a person like me can't buy because I'm not part of the racial majority. Like speaking to a white friend earlier this week, he was asking me how is this different from appetite. I also don't know. But why is this important? This completely knocks out the centrist argument that OO and presumably CO want to run. Because someone who is centrist favors the status quo, which we have just explained to you, is already skewed against everybody in a race-based politics country. There are reasons we can't deal with this, right? It's written in the constitution. People are likely to whine and play the victim card. So, I mean, we can't deal with the fact that there are universities specifically for races. What we can do is create universities for the poor, and that empowers ethnic minorities under our side of the house. Extension, who better deals with voter apathy? OG says, let's use simpler language and appeal to the economic status. OO says we lose to extremist parties. Again, I just explained why it's ridiculous because PSM has no majority at all. It's about adopting their ideologies. Number two, why the heck would people be against worker rights, social welfare, affordable housing, and anti-austerity? No, they literally live better lives. Note that OO doesn't give one example of a centrist policy. We have just given you 5. We think people are broadly okay with these sorts of policies. I don't know why remaining neutral is a reasonable alternative for most people, given that the neutral status quo is already biased against them in favor of the majority. I'll take CO.
No, none from zero.
Oh. Yes,
Okay, if your case is to say you only adopt universally agreed upon politics like affordable housing, which is not all populism is, by the way, what makes you different from other parties like PAS that can also say they support affordable housing?
Because PAS plays race-based politics. Their policies discriminate against everybody else. Like PAS people bring religion into the debate. And so people who don't subscribe to the religion or aren't part of the same race don't want to support them. I just give you like 2 minutes of this and begin my speech. Okay, let's talk about voter apathy. The first thing CG will say is that most poor people are deeply apathetic about politics. It's a dehumanizing process. Governments have been oppressive to them. We think we increase the voter turnout. Why? One, note that in Malaysia, because it's very big, it's often very difficult to travel to places to the ballot box to vote. Malaysia also experiences brain drain, so a lot of the people have to fly in from overseas to vote. The reason this is important is because voter turnout is only at 60% and ethnic minorities are severely underrepresented. OG doesn't tell you this. We will say that we appeal to issues close to their heart, which is why somebody will be more likely to come to the ballot box, because we deal with inherent cost of living issues, things like low wages, inflation, disillusion in politics. We think when you appeal to me and what directly affects me as a youth voter, people are more likely to turn up to the voter box. People are more likely to fly back from Singapore, from UK to vote, which is why this backlash argument is ridiculous. Because OP has to defend extreme race-based politics, whereas we move closer to the left, we move closer to benefiting people. Note the delta in this debate. It is about extreme religion, extremist people, versus populism and helping the poor, a large majority of which are comprising of the majority race. We think we get greater buy-in. Very proud to propose.
We would like to thank member of government for their speech. Let's now call a member of opposition.
Give me a sec. All right, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, just give me a sec. Set up my timer and I'll stop my speech. I prefer POIs verbally. Please give it within the 5th minute onwards. I'll take one for opening. Okay. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Anyways, I'm going to start this debate. Couching followed by substantive and finally comparative. Let's start with couching. What happened in the opening exchange? I think opening talks a lot about the idea surrounding populism. And that has this idea where OG has this cute idea where populism is always a push to the left. I think this scene is also passed down to closing government. And I'll talk about political realities and the truth behind it. Well, few things here, and this is where setup matters, right? I think it's about talking about why this debate is not necessarily about Pakatan Harapan turning to the left, but has to acknowledge the political realities in which Malaysia face, i.e., the demographics that the large makeup of Malaysia are conservatives and also Malays, right? So this debate is about how you engage with those political realities and why acknowledging those demographics are extremely important. So CEO is going to actually be the first team to talk about the true political realities, i.e., number one, that populism is a strategy that talks about catering to and adhering to the majority political wants of the individuals. How does this fit into Malaysia? The reality is that by virtue of this and how a large chunk of your voters are necessarily conservatives regardless of race means that a large chunk of your shift towards populism will already mean that you're shifting to the right. The only way in which you can change this, and I think you cannot buy CG's extension, which is this idea that it's actually a shift to the left because the info slide says PSM. Because the notice that the motion says about populist ideals. So if you can prove to you that populist ideals within the context of Malaysia means a greater shift to the right wing, I think their case immediately falls. OG has the same scene here because they think that populist strategy is in diametric opposition with centrist ideologies, right? But how then do we differentiate ourselves from OG? I think we're going to do two things here, but it's an explanation through substantives on the impacts, right? But let's start with number one. What does this employment of populist strategy naturally look like for Pakatan Harapan? Three things that happen here. Number one, the moment when you employ populist strategy is the moment in time you immediately break down your coalition by virtue of the parties within your coalition. If you want to talk about political realities, you have to acknowledge the parties such as DAP, Barisan National, and PKR, which are naturally more left-leaning and center-left, center-right together, as opposed to punching, going further into a populist ideology, is in a race to the bottom in which you push towards more conservative ideas. So engaging with CG here, because CG tells you that, look, we can engage in social welfare for everybody, and that's a populist policy. That would work in a less religious state. The problem is that Malaysia is quite religious. A large chunk of the people are conservatives. This means that, and also the fact that most of them are racist as well. This means that a large chunk of the time, for you to have to give everybody cash handouts, the first question and backlash that you have from the majority is going to be, why do minorities deserve this right as well? We are the oppressed Bumi Putras that need this help. And by virtue of this, any and all forms of social welfare that targets a general populace is immediately fought against. Putting up UITM is already a challenge for the current government. So if that's true, then it means you immediately lose out when the battle comes to conservatism. Any forms of social welfare you want to do, you immediately die. But secondly, is to understand that the reason why the Perikatan National coalition is strong is the ability to consolidate power within the east coast of Malaysia and the conservatives. This means in order for you to win, and the strategy here that PH needs to employ in populist ideals is to go further and be more right-wing. The problem here, even if we buy those argumentations and maybe let them have some level of ability to win, is that you can't penetrate the East Coast unless you're going super right wing. You say, yes, it's about the Bumis, and yes, it's about Islam in Malaysia. You're unable to penetrate those blocks. But thirdly, and I think this is where it's more important to the state, because notice that none of the teams realize that this is an actor debate, and we have to talk about Pakatan Harapan. This is the unique delineation that happens in closing off and closing up and clear why we win the balance. Because this is against the principles of Pakatan Harapan as a coalition who brands itself as a reform party. Pakatan Harapan's optics is a party that sells the promise of reform and change against race and religion-based politics. The shift towards populism loses any and all unique attraction towards PH, because you need to note that your largest voter base as a coalition are your liberal progressives and moderates concentrated within cities and important constituencies, right? This means you lose out all that largest voter base. So if they say you will win the next elections, you don't. Thirdly, then why you significantly lose out, why the current strategy employed by Pakatan Harapan as centrism has been the most strategic answer to solving Malaysia's voter apathy and potential wins in the future. Because centrism as a strategy allows for flexibility in policy, an ability for you to uniquely politically position your policies to shift in accordance with the wants and needs of the people
Point.
without compromising on core principles of your coalition as a whole. Go.
If OCG and CO all disagree on who populism caters to, if OG tells you that you have external benefits from populism despite the voter turnout, why shouldn't OG win?
No, because CG already explained to you what populism actually looks like. I think you have to buy that frame because it's very simple. Populism is about what people want the most, and then the problem within Malaysia is that it's still race and religion based. Cool. Lastly, so let's then buy this argumentation, and we're going to be super charitable here and let them have some part of the debate, right? Because so as much as Gov wants to argue that populism is the case line to winning, it is not, right? Because you clearly lose your voter base, you will clearly not be able to win over conservatives. But even if, let's buy that for a second and give it, maybe it is the strategy to winning. I think Pakatan Harapan as a coalition, as an actor, would not feel that the win is something that's necessarily good. By virtue of your loss of your core ideals, by virtue of your loss of your optics as a reform party. The comparative is simple. You get nothing on their side. Populism literally leads you to a downfall because you're chasing against people who can openly be racist and openly be divisive within Malaysia. The only way you stand strong and win is the moment in time where you're unique and the moment in time where centrism can change and shift towards the wants of the people. Populism is just, at the end of the day, such a bad strategy. Thank you.
We would like to thank member of opposition for their speech. Let's not call them government whip.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, just woke up. So yeah, sorry for the bad head. POIs, I'll take around like the 5th minute. And pronunciation, pronunciation POIs around 5th minute. Yeah. Right. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I start my speech, I'm going to clarify this here very explicitly. When I say Muslim people, I mean the same Malay people that CEO talks about in Malaysia. All Malay people are Muslim. All right, so that's it out of the way. I want to clarify 3 questions. The first is to explain what the historical context of Malaysia looks like. The second is to explain who are the ones that are not apathetic to voting within status quo. The third is on engagement. First question I want to answer. What's the historical context of Malaysia? Note panel that the problem that you hear from opening government is a stock debate that populism is good. But they never answer these 2 important questions. First, what do these populist ideals look like in the context of Malaysian politics when it comes to dealing with these sorts of issues involving race-based politics and racist AA affirmative action policies? Second, what is the best interest of Pakatan Harapan? The reason why this is important is it explains what the kinds of populist ideals look like and why specifically the Malaysian people will support PH when they commit to these kinds of populist policies, which is prerequisite to buying any of the material that OG explains. What does Ryan give you? Historically, voter apathy is a rampant issue within Malaysian politics. If you look at previous data, only 60% of voters turned out to vote in the last election when they were targeting 85%. All concedes that this is an obvious issue, but I want to ask the more important question in the round. Who are the ones that are most likely to be apathetic and why? And there are two main voter base. The first is the young Chinese and Indian voter base. The reason for this is that historically, Malaysia has racist affirmative action policies that cater towards the Muslim majority. So the nuance of the round here is that Malaysia already has housing policies, cash handouts, and free education, which are good welfare policies, obviously, right? But they are welfare policies that only cater towards the Muslim Bumiputra majority. The change that CG is championing for is to reinvent the status quo. So we focus more on welfare policies that cater towards universally everyone, as Ryan explains. The second voter base that are likely to be apathetic is the Dayak Bumiputra voter base. So Ryan's extension on places that are far away and it's hard to travel is actually correct, but you need some like geographic spec knowledge on this. So I'll just draw a map here. So the Dayak Bumiputra voter base, while being eligible for welfare policies, are unable to access them because they live in East Malaysia. So East Malaysia is over here, and separating them is the South China Sea, and here's West Malaysia. So the Muslim Bumiputras mostly live in the West, while the Dayak Bumiputras like Sarawak and Sabah, which is another form of Bumiputra, lives in the East. Historically, the amount of oils and funding that that the Dayak Bumiputra has mostly goes towards the Muslim Bumiputras due to unfair policies that exist. But furthermore, I'll just prove this analytically. The Dayak Bumiputras living in East Malaysia are apathetic to voting because most of the resources, if not all of the resources, go towards West Malaysia. Like literally, East Malaysia, like Sarawak, has a lot of oil, but 95% of the royalties end up going towards the Muslim Bumiputras living in West Malaysia. The reason for this is also twofold. A, East Malaysia was a new introduced state in 1965
Fine.
with the formation of Malaysia. No, thank you. And wasn't there when the constitution was drafted, which only involved the states in West Malaysia, which is why they don't get most of the funding. Second, most of the AA policies mostly only work if you're a Muslim, because predominantly, most of the discussion of politics only cater towards these people in West Malaysia, i.e., only funding schools like UITM, which is a free public university, but only allows Bumiputra demographics, but are only predominant in West Malaysia. The fact that most politicians are not Dayak Bumiputra, but Muslim Bumiputra, instead, like PAS and Perikatan Nasional, ultimately means that the current status quo shames a lot of these Dayak Bumiputras, or in that even if they're eligible for a lot of the affirmative action policies, they are unlikely to vote or support them. What is the bottom line here? The bottom line here are the two things that we prove: that the young Chinese and Indian voter base will not vote precisely because of this centrist policy that doesn't cater to them or discuss the harm of having affirmative action policies to one race. CO champions centrism because you allow some form of flexibility. No, you don't champion some form of flexibility. Even if you do, it's arguably it's arguably not going to work simply because the young Chinese and Indian voter base feel like there's no change. Because insofar that you don't champion for something incredibly liberal, you are unlikely to get any of these things. And furthermore, we also proved that the Dayak Bumiputra that lives in East Malaysia, despite being eligible for these AA policies, cannot access them because geographically they're far away. What this ultimately means is that they're unlikely to vote. Question number 2, who are the ones that are not apathetic to voting? But before I move on, I'll take a point from CO.
Yeah, so are you prioritizing AA reforms for minority cultures of Dayaks, Chinese, and Indians over the majority of Muslim Malays on your side of the house?
Okay, so this deals directly with the second question. Who are the ones that are not apathetic to voting? A, the Muslim Bumiputra majority. Look, because they're not going to vote for Pakatan Harapan, they're going to vote for PAS and Perikatan Nasional because these are the right-wing parties that further cater towards their issues. Look, CO tries to explain that you want to be more centrist so you can get these kinds of voter base into your party. The problem with it is that this is not good because even if you do, it's unlikely to work when you have another way more far right center base living in the status quo where they can go towards Perikatan Nasional or PAS that caters to not just Bumiputra policies but Muslim and religious Bumiputra policies that take into account religion. Secondly, Gelson was right in saying people are tired because of PAS and Perikatan's national using of populist rhetoric. But that's because the populist rhetoric and policies that they pushed for was only for the Muslim Bumiputras, not the Chinese, not the Indian, not for the Dayaks certainly living in Sarawak, where currently I am staying. So ultimately, at the end of the day, you lock out the other voter bases like like Chinese, Indian, and Dayak voter bases, which ultimately, and the only ones you have left is Muslim Bumiputra, which means that they only go for Pakatan Harapan. Engagement. So Okay, I'll just deal with closing opposition because I think we already beat OO enough. CO tries to break the debate again by saying our populist policies are not left, but actually right. PH is comprised of specifically PKR and DAP, which they concede to is actually left. So why would they agree to this and why would they decide that? But also read the fucking info slide. Like, if you look at the info slide, it says PSM is known for populist and progressive ideals, such as workers' rights, social welfare, and affordable housing, which ultimately suggests that populist and progressive ideals go hand in hand, and it's not this super right-wing like amalgamation that CO is fighting for. So the weighing here is on likelihood. OO wants to adopt centrist policies, but as we explained, centrist policies lock out Chinese, Indian, and Dayak Bumiputra voter bases. So the only voter base that remains left is Muslim Bumiputra voter base. And as we explained, we'll vote for PAS and PN because they bring religion into the debate. For all those reasons, CG.
Thank you, Government Whip, for your speech. Let's now call an opposition.
Hi, am I audible? Is the volume okay?
Yes.
Okay, wait, hold on. Let me. Okay. I hope everyone can see me as well.
Yep.
Where's my pen? Okay. I'll take POIs in chat, probably from opening. But closing, if you want, you can ask them as well. Okay. I think something to recognize is that the core of debate was always about political strategy. Populism in a vacuum is an amazing idea, but coupled with the inherent context of the fragility of a Malaysian political system and countervailing narratives of extremism that actually do get people votes, if you can see in PAS and you can see in PN, that these natures of populism is an extremely bad idea. PH needs to stick to something that seems to work, not risk it all on a policy that will lose them everything in the next election, right? I'll go house by house and talk about just a bit of meta in all of the houses. I'll go house by house without them. I don't know why words are not coming to me. Let's first talk about CG. And let's talk about CG. Two pieces of meta here. First, I'm unclear as to what new material they bring, absent of what OG already does, because a vast majority of what Ryan won, member of Gov says is predicated on a lot of what opening has already talked about. They don't respond to OO in terms of effectiveness about why their policy is likely to be vastly ineffective, and their mech to solve voter apathy is exactly the same as OG. So I'm unclear as to what value this brings. But then secondly, and in Gov Whip, Ryan brings up the most insane lines of logic to me, which is that it is not strategic to cater to a Muslim majority, who is the majority in your country, by the way, by over 60%, because they were never going to vote for you anyways. Three things. Number one, this is a blatant lie. The fact that the PH coalition consists of PKR, which is a majority Muslim party led by Anwar, and BN, which is a majority Muslim party led by Hamidi, I am unclear as to why it is strategic for them to not cater to a Muslim majority voter base and cater to the small voter base that is already apathetic or would already vote for you to begin with. I am unsure as to why this was CG's extension into the debate. But secondly, even if this wasn't a lie, this was blatantly unstrategic for PH to do because they aren't the majority individuals. So even if you get every single Chinese, Indian, and minority individual to vote for you, you'd still lose to a coalition of PN and PAS. That is the reality of what Malaysian politics looks like. But third, I am unclear as to just why this was an option to begin with. Let's talk about three very quick responses to what CG says, right? So the only new things that CG brings, absent of this ridiculous understanding, is number one, the context of why this can be done because religious-based politics are bad. I like to note that this is an assumption that religion doesn't work in Malaysia. This is untrue. The very reason why Gelson claims that you can't out-populist PSM is further exemplified by outside the house. Because the reason you can't out-populist parties like PSM and PAS is the very reason because they use race-based politics. Because neither government side wants to acknowledge that their populism is going to come in the form of race-based politics. That means we fill in the gap for OO by telling you the very reason you lose is not just because they've been there, but because they use rhetoric that you are unable to use. And that's the reason why engaging in populism is going to be a very bad idea for you as a political strategy. But number two, and this idea from both government thinks that it looks like the shift to the left. Yes, Next, well, the info slide says PSM's version of populism is worker rights and going down to the ground. This is not what populism is on net, especially when PAS and PN engage in similar levels of populism and it's to the majority as to where the voters come from. And the very fact that PSM doesn't get votes, which means that PH shift to populism is more likely going to be towards the right, which alienates a vast majority of your existing voter bases, which is argumentation that came up from side that doesn't get any response from Ryan. It is unstrategic due to your demographic. Finally, they argue that it is important to engage in populism so you can cater for geographical individuals who cannot have access to vote. I don't know why you have to be populist to do this. I think you can just be not populist and want more people to vote. I'm not clear why this is an exclusive populist benefit. The weighing here for CG is simple. I spent too much time already. Even if you believe the context is true, given that their ideas are predicated on OG, that means they must come downstream of basically everyone else in the debate. If their only strategy is catering to the left that nobody already wants to cater to, given the fact that most Malaysians are conservative, I'm unclear how they get more votes. I'm unclear how they change the debate. I'm unclear how they take anything but a force. Next, let's talk about OG. So OG, two meta points in terms of OG, right? Number one, I want to know the extremely soft case that comes off of opening government in terms of what populism is. I'm unsure how this is different from any existing mechanisms or political methods that Pakatan Harapan already uses, because they refuse to engage that they're going to go some level of extreme or some level of race-based politics because they argue centrism. But I'll explain later as to why this doesn't make sense, because most of the policies you're going to pass in this centrist version of populism is just not significantly different from the kinds of rhetoric that you're already doing. But secondly, the mechanistic links about emotional rhetoric are already symmetrical to what PH does in status quo. We already call out individuals. We already say that people are corrupt and that you shouldn't vote for them. I don't understand why more mudslinging is something that OG wants or something that's necessarily beneficial in the context of the debate. But then two extraneous responses to OG. Number one, they argue internal strength. I think the flip comes very early from Gelson as to why internal strength is not true. But I think we prove it even further by proving you directly why, at the point in which you engage in populism, you detract directly from PH principles. What does this do? Number one, it fractionates your existing party members like DAP and PKR who don't want to be populist, who have founded their 60-year campaigns on being centrist. You fractionate their instances, which is why we better prove to you why internal strength is unlikely to happen. But number two, in terms of external support, they don't claim why populism was a tipping point in order to make sure individuals have more external support. But even if it was, we tell you that it fractionates existing voter bases who already voted for you because you were centrist. At the point in which you're populist and catering to a certain aspect of politics that individuals on the ground who already vote for you don't like, is at the point in which you get more voter apathy on the side of OG. Therefore, weighing. But before that, I'll take Aidan. Go.
Yeah, so assuming that it's true that they already use emotional rhetoric, then what is the harm in actually using it?
What do you mean? There's no harm. You're saying we need to use emotional rhetoric. The reality is we already do. You needed to prove how more significant or different this emotional rhetoric was at the point in which populism existed. If you can't prove that, you have no benefit. That's not a POI. Finally, in terms of weighing. So let's look at this. Either OG has centrist populism, which I'm unclear then what the real delta is, given that a lot of the rhetoric they claim centrist populism is already exists in status quo, or they get actual populism per what CG says, which is likely to alienate and destroy existing bases, because if you're populist left, a lot of the right majority is not going to vote for you. If you're populist right, a lot of your current voter bases who are centrist and left-leaning are going to detract from your party. Both are vastly both strategic, both compromise the call of the party, both come lower to the opposition bench. Why do we beat OO? Three reasons. Number one, we explained to you why centrism being flexible goes beyond what OO claims. Because OO claims centrism is simply uninflammatory. We proved to you why flexibility also allows us to be strategic in passing policies and getting voter bases and solving political apathy in the long run. Number two, we evolved the political apathy argument by giving you a very key strategy, by waiting, by saying that a lot of the instances and why we lost our flash in the pan instances, that voter apathy does have this and centrism is best able to cater. But we're also finally more nuanced to the actors to why the coalition stability is more important. These are exclusive mechanisms that CO brings you. CO takes it.
Thank you, opposition, opposition. Thank you, debaters. We now virtually cross the house, and good luck everyone to the and see you in the break.